All right, hey again everyone. It's time for module video 2 of module 7, in which we'll be talking about the powers of the president beyond those powers that have been enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States. So just jumping right in here, we can think about the idea that in addition to these enumerated powers, the president has what we might call delegated powers. And this is a very important concept I want you to pay attention to. And that's the idea that we began talking about in the last video, where we spoke about the idea that the president is the executive of laws. And that's why the president is called the leader of the executive branch. And so what happens here in the sort of process after the bill becomes a law, after the president signs it, after the president is able to, potentially create a signing statement even where they provide some instructions as to how they would like the bill to actually function, Congress gives the executive branch the ability to specify the details of those laws. And so essentially what we have is a situation where the executive branch is the one who's actually carrying that law into practice. But as laws become increasingly complicated, it's up to that bureaucracy to actually make a lot of consequential decisions about the way that the law actually works. And so in just a moment, we're going to see a sort of a depiction of the kinds of bureaucracies that exist under the direction of the White House. And we'll talk maybe about some examples of laws that might be implemented by those bureaucracies and how delegated powers, essentially the idea that that executive branch has more and more authority to determine the details of that legislation, have expanded over time. All right, so let's take a careful look at this depiction of the executive branch as it's described in the textbook. So if we look here, I want to draw your attention first and foremost to the cabinet. And the cabinet is an incredibly important set of advisors to the president who also serve as the chiefs, basically, of a number of different very important bureaucracies in the federal government. So you can look at, for example, the Secretary of Defense here, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the Secretary of the Treasury, for example, all kinds of different individuals who have incredibly important powers in determining how laws get implemented, get executed in the United States. So if we go up here to, for example, to the Department of the Education, I think we've spoken about before, the Secretary of Education is Betsy DeVos currently. This is a political appointee, somebody who Trump essentially nominated, was confirmed by Congress despite some very tense hearings, if you recall that moment back in 2017. So Betsy DeVos might find that there's a law that's been passed by Congress that, for example, changes the way that student loans are handled, student loans are dispersed, student loan payments are collected. And so it's then Betsy DeVos's job to instruct the Department of Education to actually do something about that law, to implement it so that people who have student loans actually experience those changes. Otherwise, again, it's just a piece of paper. There's nobody out there who's actually telling you to do anything differently. And so, again, that's actually something that's been in the news recently. Betsy DeVos has come under fire a little bit about some of these rules, essentially, that the Department of Education has adopted related to borrowing and lending and student loans. If you think about this, right, let's think about another maybe very basic example might be, we could think about the Secretary of Transportation. So the Secretary of Transportation might create some kind of rule about highway signage that says, highway signage, you need to have a blinking orange light on top of any, rest stop exit sign. Okay, that seems like a really random, arbitrary example. But let's imagine that this Secretary of Transportation decided that was going to be a rule. Now, is that a law, or is it something a little bit different? Because if we remember, Congress, which is not represented in this figure, right? We've got Congress over here somewhere that's passed a law, and that says something like, maybe the details of that law, let's call it the 2020, Transportation Safety Act, specifies that there needs to be adequate signage at rest stops. And that's all the law says, adequate signage at rest stops. Now, when that bill comes to the president and is signed and becomes law, the cabinet member who's responsible for the implementation or the execution of that bill will read that bill and say, okay, adequate signage at a rest stop, okay. And then they will tell their sort of rank and file bureaucrats in that specific department to provide details that make that law essentially happen. And so it might be the Secretary of Transportation's idea, or it might be somebody else who's working in that department. It might be their idea to say, okay, well, what's one way that we might improve the visibility of these things? How about a blinking light? Now, a blinking light is not written anywhere in the bill. The bill is more vague than that. It's more broad. It just says provide adequate signage. And so the blinking light is an additional sort of thing that then gets added, and this rule then gets essentially carried forth to all of the sort of federally funded highways. And so the rule is not part of the law, but the rule is essentially an interpretation of the law that allows for real changes to actually happen. And so you can see that a law which goes through and is read by this department is then sort of translated, and rules are created which then actually specify the granular, nitty-gritty, specific details on the ground of the way that these things actually work. And so this is what we mean when we talk about delegated powers becoming greater in American politics. Because again, we said that all of these cabinet officials, all these individuals that have been appointed by the President of the United States to serve here in these cabinet positions, these are political appointees, meaning that they, again, are on the same page with the President and are trying as much as possible to do what the President wants. So when the legislature, when Congress creates a bill that's vague, that has room for you to interpret, oh, blinking light, or, flashing sign, or neon sign, or, big arrow, or blue sign, or orange sign, or whatever, right? When there are lapses in the details, essentially, that Congress passes to the executive then gets the ability to have more wiggle room to determine exactly how those pieces of legislation are going to work for people, as long as it remains within the letter of that law, right? You can't change the law. The law is the law. It's been passed by Congress, and so that's the essentially framework for the way that these things need to work. When we get down to the details, though, it's about the implementation of those policy details that fall to the bureaucracies. And this is one of the major ways in which the president has become more powerful over time, because this delegated power, Congress essentially gives the president more and more power as laws become more complicated, and there are more and more sort of areas where the cabinet positions can interpret and provide new and different kinds of details that actually affect people on the ground. So again, just to really very basically sum up, a law is not the same as a rule. A rule is something that's adopted by the executive that fits within the framework of laws, but comes from the executive itself. Now, the last thing I want to say about this, as we think about the cabinet positions and about these specific political appointees, is the idea that the president is also capable of signaling to the bureaucracy some of the intentions of the presidential staff. And that is essentially a thing called the signing statement. So when the president signs a bill into law, the president is able to use this, essentially the power of the sticky note. It's not a literal sticky note, but it might as well be. Essentially, the president can take a bill that says something broad, that says something vague, and then put on top of it a statement and have a public sort of display where they sign, the president might sign this bill and then say something either out loud or on a piece of paper, essentially, that gets attached to this bill and sent to the relevant cabinet department where it will be implemented. I want you to interpret and implement the law in this way. And so this is kind of an additional legislative-ish kind of power that the president has to direct these cabinet positions to interpret the law one way or the other. So again, I just want to really, emphasize the idea that laws and rules are not the same. The bureaucracies have expanded their powers over time as laws become more technical and more complex, and there's just more opportunities for the cabinet to interpret. And that has, of course, made the president much more powerful over time relative to Congress. So these delegated powers are really important and something that we cannot